In this video, I will show you the creation process of how I created this Mars Rover 3D artwork in Blender. And if you'd like to take a look at all of the final renders, then you can check out the final artwork on my ArtStation profile. I will have a link to the finished artwork in the description. And if you'd like to purchase the finished Mars Rover 3D model, then I will have links in the description to where you can purchase the finished Mars Rover. And you can also get access to the Mars Rover 3D model on my Patreon page. So when I'm starting off creating a new artwork, the first thing that I always do is collect reference images. So I look online for other artworks which are similar to what I'm trying to create. And so I collect a bunch of other artworks as well as reference and inspiration, and I download them all to a folder, and then as I'm creating the artwork, I can look back at the reference images to help me with the creation process. And for reference images, I use an amazing program called PureRef. So PureRef is a really great free reference image program, and you can simply drag and drop images from your file browser into the program, and you can also drag and drop images from the internet into the program. And then you can organize the images, kind of move them around and align them, and then I just put the program on a separate monitor, and then I can look at all the different reference images as I'm creating the artwork. So once I've collected a collection of reference images, it's time to do some sketching. Because before I jump into Blender, I want a better idea of the Martian rover design. So here are some different sketches that I did. Most of these sketches I just did in my sketchbook, but then I also did some digital sketches in Krita as well. And while I was sketching out these design ideas, I was looking at references of other Martian rover artworks that other artists have created. And using a variety of many different artworks as reference can be very helpful because other artists have created some really cool design ideas, and so you can use different design ideas from other artists, not copying one single artist, but just using different design elements from different artworks. And then you can use that to create your own original artwork. Alright, so after I finished those Mars Rover sketches, I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted my Mars Rover to look like. So I hopped into Blender, and of course the first thing that I did was delete the default cube, because you always have to delete the default cube and add a new one. You can't use the default cube. So then I added a cube and I cut it in half, and then added a mirror modifier so that I could mirror one side of the rover and then it would mirror to the other side. And then I also added some loop cuts and then added some bevels to the side of the rover to get that cool sci-fi shape. And then I also pulled out the front of the rover to create the cockpit with the windows. And then I also insetted the faces there on the front and then deleted those front faces, and then that way it makes those cool triangle shapes, and I used that to create some cool triangle sci-fi windows on the front of the rover's cockpit. And then I also used the knife tool to cut a triangle in that face, and then again I insetted those faces and then just deleted the inner faces. So this way we have some really cool sci-fi shaped windows for the cockpit of the rover. And then after that I made the cockpit a separate object, and then I gave it the solidify modifier so that those little beams there are actually solid. And then I also selected all the inner vertices of the window and I duplicated those, and then I made them their own object, and then in edit mode with all of them selected I just filled all the faces by pressing F, and then this way I have a separate object for the windows. And then I also turned down the solidify so the windows weren't quite as thick. And then I just decided to use a different object for the Mars Rover body, so I just added another cube and then gave it a mirror modifier, and then you can see I'm beveling those edges there to give it kind of a cool sci-fi shape and kind of bringing down the bottom there. And then I wanted to have an airlock on the back so that the astronauts could go into the Mars rover, so I started to model kind of an airlock or kind of a separate area on the back of the rover. And then also duplicating that face there on the top because I wanted to start to add some details onto the top of the rover. So I extruded down this cube here and added a bevel modifier to it, and then I also wanted to create some sci-fi metal piping and bars. So to do that I added a curve object, and then I'm just using those handles there to shape the curve. And then I gave the curves a mirror modifier so it would be mirrored to both sides, and then just brought it into the mirror. And then I gave that curve object some depth so now you can actually see it and it's actually visible. So now that metal bar actually has some thickness. And then just kind of shaping it and sticking it inside the rover. And then I duplicated another face, and I'm using this face to create some lights on the front of the rover. So if they're driving around on Mars and it's dark, they'll actually have some front headlights on the rover. And then just adding some details to those headlights headlights. And then I turned on the Add Mesh Extra Objects add-on, and it's an add-on built into Blender in Blender's user preferences. And then once the add-on is turned on, you can press Shift A and you can go to Mesh, and then there is this Extra Objects honeycomb. So you can add the honeycomb, and then if you open up that side panel right there, you can actually change the size of the honeycomb. And so once that was created, I added it to the headlights object, and then I stuck the honeycomb shape into the headlights and then also extruded it back to give it some thickness. And then I just deleted any of the extra honeycomb pieces that I didn't need. And so this gave a really cool honeycomb grid shape inside the headlight. And then I duplicated that piping and I rotated it over, and I added that piping to the side of the rover just to give it some more details. Or maybe an astronaut might climb on top of the rover to do some maintenance or something, so he might need some bars to grab onto. Or maybe those could be some bars where you could attach equipment onto. And then I also wanted to give the headlights some wires to look like they're actually receiving power from the rover, so I duplicated the curve and then used that curve to create some wires. And then I just extruded those wires or cables into that other cube there. And maybe that other cube there is like a battery on the top of the rover. And then I also wanted to add some other piping just to give it some more sci-fi details, so I added some other piping there. And then I wanted to add some bolts on the front of the rover to give it some more sci-fi details, so I added a cylinder and I made it really small. And then I turned on the snapping feature, and I set up the snapping feature settings so that it would snap to the faces. And then I could just duplicate those bolts and move them all around the front of the rover. So I just kept duplicating those bolts, putting them around that main frame there for the rover windows, and that gives some really cool sci-fi bolts to the rover. And I do add those bolts pretty much all over the rover. And then I also wanted to add a big metal frame to the front of the rover, kind of to look like a big bumper, or maybe also you could like hang some equipment on it, or also store some items there in the front area. So I duplicated those top bars and I kind of extruded them down and shaped them around the bottom of the rover, just kind of underneath the windows. So I just extruded those big metal bars and extruded them into the rover, and then duplicated some of those bars to give a nice metal frame there underneath the rover's cockpit. And then also adding some more details to the side of the rover, so I duplicated that face there and extruded it out, and then made the bevel smaller and just kind of made some cool sci-fi details there on the side of the rover. So now it was time to start adding the wheels, so I added another cylinder and rotated it sideways and kind of made it smaller for the wheels and just stuck it there on the side of the rover. And then I also wanted to add like a satellite dish on top of the rover, and I thought maybe this satellite dish could be used as communication from the Martian base to the Martian rover. So I modeled the satellite dish and then gave it a subsurf modifier to smooth it out, and then I also added another cylinder and then put the satellite dish on that cylinder on the top of the rover. And then I wanted to add a lot of sci-fi details on the top of the rover, so I added a cube and just kind of duplicated the cube and added some different little cubes and details there on the top of the rover. So then I hopped back over to the wheels because I wanted to model some more of the wheels, so I'm just like extruding out some details there in the wheels. And I do think there's benefit in kind of modeling the whole thing at once instead of just going into tons of detail in just one area, because if you're modeling the entire thing and kind of jumping around to different areas, that way if you notice some flaw in the design or you don't like something about the design, then you can go back and change it and you haven't added a ton of detail to one area. And then I wanted the astronauts to be able to exit the back rover's airlock and do an EVA. And so when the astronauts exit the airlock, I wanted to have sort of like a porch on the back of the rover. So I duplicated that metal beam there to kind of start making a porch on the back of the rover. And then I also wanted to make sure the size of the rover was consistent, so I turned on the Blender Rigify add-on. It's an add-on which is built into Blender. And so once the add-on is turned on, you can press Shift A and you can go down to Armature, and then you can add the Human Meta Rig. And this is going to add a bone setup for a human character. So then I duplicated that human armature and I put some on the front, and then I also put some inside the rover's cockpit, and then I could use that as a size reference to make sure I modeled everything at the correct size. So then here I am duplicating those metal beams for the porch and also adding some other details there on the back of the porch. And then I added a bevel there to the edge of the airlock to make it more sci-fi, and then insetted that face and extruded it back for the sci-fi airlock. and then also creating a separate door object for the top there. And I wanted to add a cool looking sci-fi window there on the airlock door, so I made this basic triangle object and I extruded it back, and then I added some bevels to the side of it, so there's kind of like this cool sci-fi triangle window there that you can look out before you step outside. And then just modeling that back porch there, so I duplicated that curve and made a bunch of bars there to kind of create a metal porch. And then I added some much smaller metal pieces and duplicated them to create kind of that grid there on the bottom. And then I duplicated that curve again and rotated it around the porch to create a railing. And then I actually broke the railing off from the mirror modifier because on the front of the porch I needed somewhere for the astronauts to actually walk down to the Martian surface. So I actually pulled the railing out of the mirror modifier so that there was an empty space there in the center. And then I'm going to add some steps there going from the porch to the ground. And then also adding some more details there to the airlock door. And I wanted some cool mechanism that you could use to unlock the airlock door, so I added this circular object, and then I extruded up that little piece there to kind of make a handle where you could unlock the airlock. And then I needed some leg object to connect the rover wheels to the rover body, so I added a cube and added a mirror modifier, and I just brought it over there to the side of the rover, and then I started modeling some sci-fi details to it, and then added a mirror modifier going up and down as well, and just started adding more sci-fi details to it. Also adding that cylinder there to kind of make a rotating joint area. And then I wanted to add more details to the wheel, so I added a bevel modifier to the wheels, and then started modeling some other pieces. And I wanted to create a lot of details there on the treads of the wheels, so I added a cube with a bevel modifier, and then I didn't want to have to model all the treads individually, so I added an array modifier to the treads object. And then I needed the treads to rotate around the wheel, so I added an empty and I put the empty in the very center of the wheel. And then back on the array modifier on the treads, I turned on the object offset, and then in the object offset I selected that empty. And this way the treads would rotate around the center of that empty, and the empty is in the very center there of the wheels. So then I just rotated the empty around and the treads rotated around the wheels, and then I just turned up the count to create as many treads as I needed. And then the treads weren't very detailed, so I added some more details to the first tread, and because I'm using an array modifier, it arrayed the object, and so then all the treads have the same details. And then I wanted some more support inside the wheels, so I added another cube, kind of scaled it down and extruded it out, and then I duplicated it and rotated it around to kind of make some metal supports there inside the wheels, and then adding some more details in the wheels. And also on those metal supports I added a bevel modifier to give them a cool sci-fi shape. And adding some bolts as well. I wanted to add bolts all over the rover to give it lots of detail, so I duplicated those bolts and then I just kind of rotated them around to give some bolts all around the wheels. So the wheel modeling was finished, so I duplicated the wheels and I created 3 wheels on each side so that there is a total of 6 wheels on the rover. And then I went back to those rover legs and I added some more details, so I extruded out that cylinder there, and the cylinder would attach to the rover's body. And adding some more cool sci-fi details to the legs there. And adding bolts as well. I pretty much added bolts all over the rover. And then I also extruded out some of the faces and kind of scaled them down to give a cool beveled shape there on the side. So once the rover's legs were finished, I moved them down there into the center of the wheels. And then I set the origin point to where the legs would rotate and just rotated it over to the side. And then I duplicated it again and I made a smaller one for the center one. So I went into edit mode and I made those legs smaller so that they wouldn't need to go as far to connect to the wheels. And then again, I wanted to add lots of cool sci-fi details all over the rover, so I added a plane and then I stuck the plane on the side of the rover, and then I used that to create some cool metal panels on the side of the rover, and adding some bevels there on the side to give it some cool shapes. And then just duplicating that metal panel and moving it all around. And then I also wanted to add some cords or wires to the top of the rover, and this could be used to like transfer fuel or maybe transfer electricity or oxygen. So I added another curve and gave it some thickness, and then I stuck it on the top of the rover and I just extruded it out and moved it all around to give some cool details there to the top of the rover. And then I duplicated some of those cubes and stuck them all around the top of the rover so that the cords had somewhere to connect to. And I just continued to do that all over the top of the rover. And the entire time that I was doing this, I had the reference images on another monitor to get some ideas for cool sci-fi shapes and designs. ones. Now also on the side here, I insetted that face and I extruded it back to create kind of a window there. And then I headed back over to the airlock and I added a bunch of bolts there to the back of the airlock. And then on the very back wall of the rover, I duplicated the face and again added some more sci-fi panels. And then I wanted to add some storage tanks to the outside of the rover, so I added a cylinder and made it longer, and then I also added like some straps around the tank to make it look like it's attached to the side of the rover. And I was thinking this could be like an oxygen tank, but it could also store other things like electricity. And then I still hadn't created the steps which are going from the back porch down to the ground, and the astronauts need something that they can climb down from the porch to the Martian surface. So I duplicated those metal bars and just created some basic steps that the astronauts could climb down on, and duplicating some more bars to give that porch there some more structural support. And then I wanted to add some steps that the astronauts could actually walk on, so I added a plane there and gave it some thickness, and then duplicated it and made some steps that the astronauts could walk down on. And then I duplicated those bars and brought them down to hold up the steps. And then I extruded the bars up and stuck them to the porch. And then just adding a bunch more bars there to give the stairs some more support. And then I also thought it would be cool to add some solar panels to the rover so that the rover could collect some of its own power as it's driving around on Mars. So I added a plane and kind of rotated it to the side, and then I added some loop cuts to create a grid shape, and then I extruded the faces in and extruded them down to look like solar panels. And then I needed to connect these solar panels to the rover, so I added like a cube there on the back and gave that cube some details and then kind of extruded it back. And then I also added a cylinder and I rotated the cylinder over, and I used that kind of as a metal beam to connect the solar panels to the rover. And there is the finished Mars Rover 3D model. So the modeling was finally finished. So before I add materials, I want to add some lighting, because if I do the materials before the lighting, then it's actually hard to see what the materials will look like. So I wanted to get some very cool Martian lighting. So for the lighting, I used the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on. And I actually created a dedicated add-on review video to the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on. So if you'd like to check out that review video, link is in the description. And it's an amazing add-on for getting realistic skies and sky lighting. And I will also have an affiliate link in the description to the product on Blender Market. So if you purchase the add-on through my link, then I'll earn a small commission, and that's a great way to help support me. Now, the Physical Starlight and Atmosphere add-on comes with some sky presets. So in the asset browser, I added the Mars preset, and it gave me some really nice Martian lighting. So I can definitely recommend that add-on for getting outdoor skies and sky lighting. So it was now time to create the materials. So I started off by adding a basic glass material to the windows, and then I also started creating a dirty old metal material for the bars. Now I wanted to make those bars look like they were kind of old and worn, and I also wanted to make them look like they had a layer of dust on them. So to do that, I added in the ambient occlusion node, and then I added a color ramp to control the ambient occlusion. So this way most of the metal bars were gray, but then they also had some orangey reddish colors to look like Martian dust which had collected in the corners. And then also added a noise texture and put that into the bump just to give a little bit of bump all over the metal bars. And then I added that metal bars material to all of the other metal bars on the rover. And then I got started with the main metal base of the rover. So this material was procedural as well, so I added a noise texture to give the metal some noise and made it a metallic material, and then added it to the main base of the rover, and then also adding in that glass material to those other windows. And then also to make the bolts stand out a bit, I gave them a very dark metal material. And adding the metal bars material to the back porch there, and I do think that material looks really nice on those metal bars. And then also giving another basic metal material to the satellite dish. And then I created a procedural rubber material for the tires, and you can see here that I did add some subsurface scattering to the rubber on the tires, but I later decided just to turn that off because I didn't really like how it looked. And then giving another metal material to those metal support pieces inside the wheels. Now for the solar panels material, I did start by downloading this solar panels texture from Ambient CG, but then I later decided to use my procedural solar panels material instead. And I have a specific tutorial on how to create those procedural solar panels, so if you'd like to check out that tutorial, link is in the description. And then for the steps on the back of the rover, I created another procedural material as well. So so I used a brick texture, but then I turned the offset to 0, and this way it gave a nice little grid, and then I also plugged that grid into the normal to give it some bump, and then also just plugged in some other procedural noise to give it kind of a dirty metal look, and giving a cool kind of reddish tinted metal to those legs there on the rover. And to make those legs look like they had a lot of dust and dirt over them, I added the geometry node, and then I used the pointiness value, and the pointiness value is going to make the edges of the object lighter, and so that way it kind of looked worn and old, and it also looked like it had dust on it, and then also gave that some procedural noise into the normal as well. And then I also added an emission material to the back face of the headlights, and that way the headlights will actually be emitting light. And then because the windows were transparent, you could actually see into the cockpit, and I didn't want to spend a ton of time modeling a super detailed cockpit because that would add way more time to the project, but I did add some basic seat objects inside the cockpit. So this was basically just a cube that I extruded out, and then I gave it a subdivision surface modifier to smooth it out, and then added some loop cuts there onto the seats. Now I wanted to make the cockpit windows look kind of dirty and dusty because they're on Mars. So what I did in the glass material is I added a mix shader, and then I mixed together the glass shader and the principled shader. And then as the factor, I added a detailed noise texture. And then to make the noise texture more contrasty, I added a color ramp, and I made that noise texture much more contrasty, and that noise texture is going into the factor of the mix shader. And then for the principled shader, I added a dark brown material. And so the dark brown material is going to look like dust and dirt on the windows. And so you can see I'm making the noise texture very detailed by turning up the detail and the roughness, and so it makes the windows look like they're very dirty and they have little bits of dirt and dust all over. And then I needed to add a material for the seats, so I decided to use my procedural leather material, and I have a specific tutorial on how to create that procedural leather material, links in the description if you'd like to check it out. And then the leather material is brown, but I thought it would look better if it was gray, so I played around with the material and made it just kind of like a dark gray leather. And then it was also kind of bumpy, so I turned down the bump as well to make it less bumpy. Now I wanted to give the entire scene a very cool atmospheric effect. So to do this, I added a cube, and I scaled the cube up to fit the entire scene, and then I added the principled volume shader. And I actually have a specific tutorial on how to add fog into your 3D scenes, so if you'd like to check out that tutorial, link is in the description. And then I gave the principled volume shader an orange color to kind of look more like Mars, because Mars is kind of orange. Now I wanted some variety in the density of the dust, so I added a noise texture, and I plugged the noise texture into the density, and then I added a color ramp to play around with that density amount and make it more contrasty. So this way the atmosphere looks like it has little clouds of dust. So some parts are more dusty and then other parts are less dusty. And I'm using that color ramp there to make the noise texture more contrasty. And adding that dust effect really made the scene more believable, and it made it a lot more interesting and made it feel more real. And then just to make the lighting a little bit better and make the rover kind of pop out of the background, I did add some area lights, and I put the area lights around the rover to give some subtle rim lights and also give the rover some cool reflections there on the side. Alright, so it was now time to create the Martian environment. And to do this, I used Blender's built-in landscape add-on. So if you go to Blender's user preferences and search for landscape, you can add the landscape add-on, and then in Blender you can press Shift-A and you can go to mesh, and then you can add the landscape. And then there's a bunch of settings that you can play around with to change the noise of the landscape. So then once I created some cool landscape, I stuck that underneath the rover, and then I didn't want the ground to be going through the rover's wheels. So in edit mode, I turned on the proportional editing, and then I just played around with the shape of it to make sure that the ground wasn't going through the rover's wheels. Now for the Martian surface texture, I added in this sandy gravel 01, and this is a free texture from cgbookcase.com, so I'll have the link in the description if you'd like to check out this texture. And I think this texture worked really well for the Martian surface. So I downloaded that free texture and I added it to the Martian surface. And then I used this really cool texturing method that I like to use where you don't have to use any UV mapping. And I have a specific tutorial on how to set that up, so I'll have a link in the description if you'd like to check out that cool texturing method without using UVs. And I used that to add the Martian surface material onto the ground. And then I also wanted to give the ground a bunch more detail, so I added the displacement modifier, and then over there in the texture panel I added the procedural clouds. And then back over on the displacement modifier I turned the strength down, and this gave a bunch more detail and bump to the Martian surface. And then to give it even more detail I added a procedural noise texture, and I plugged that into the normal with a bump just to give it even more detail and bump. And then for the rest of the environment in the background, I went into edit mode of the ground object and I turned on the proportional editing, and then I just kind of brought up the background to kind of give it some hills. But I wanted to add some more hills to the background, so I took the ground object and I duplicated it and I stuck 2 of them on both sides of the rover. And then I just used the proportional editing to make it kind of bumpy and look like some hills in the background. So it was now time to render out the first version and kind of see how the finished render was looking. So I gave the scene a render, and then I did also do a little bit of compositing to start to make the image look nicer in the compositor. So in the compositor I added the denoise node to denoise the image and get rid of all that noise, and then I also added some RGB curves to do some color correction and make the scene look more orange and make it look more like Mars. And then I wanted to give it a cool sci-fi effect, so I added the lens distortion node, and I just turned up the lens distortion just a tiny little bit to give it a cool sci-fi look. And then I also added the glare node into the compositor to give some of the shiny bits some glare, and then also the glare node gave those front headlights some glow as well. And then also in the compositor I added a vignette, so I added the box mask node and I made it bigger so it almost fit the entire scene. And then I added the blur node to blur the edges, and then I mixed that with an alpha over. And so this way it makes the edges of the scene darker and it helps to bring your eyes into the center of the scene. And I do really like that effect of the vignette. So the scene was looking pretty cool, but there was one big thing missing, and that was all of the rocks on the Martian surface. So I hadn't added any rocks yet. So I already had some Martian rocks that I created, and that was from my Martian Environment Blender course. So it's a Blender course which I am selling on my Gumroad store, and in that tutorial we create this Martian environment right here. And in that tutorial I had already created a bunch of Martian rocks, and so to be able to work faster I just appended in those rocks into the Blender file, and that saved me a lot of time because I didn't have to create all of the rocks. And if you'd like to check out that Martian Environment Blender course, I'll have the link in the description, and I'll also have a link in the description to the trailer video as well. So I just added in those rocks, and then I started to manually place the big rocks all over the scene, and this really helped to make it more realistic and make it feel more like Mars. And also some of those big flat rocks, I stuck them underneath the Martian surface, and then I just had them peeking out a little bit from the Martian sand. And I also used the proportional editing to kind of bring up those flat rocks just so that they're sticking out of the Martian sand a little bit, and this really did help to improve the scene. And then I just continued to duplicate those big rocks and I put them all around the scene. And I also duplicated many of those rocks and put them in the background on those hills there in the back. Now obviously for the smaller rocks and the pebbles, I didn't want to manually place them because that would take way too much time and it would also add way too much geometry to the scene. So for the smaller rocks and the pebbles, I used geometry nodes to place the rocks all over the ground. And if you'd like to learn how to distribute objects on a plane using geometry nodes, then I have 2 tutorials on that. So I have this tutorial right here on how to distribute objects on a plane, and then I also have another tutorial on how to do the same thing, but in the other tutorial I show you how to weight paint the plane, and then I show you how to set up the weight painting so that the objects are only distributed where you've weight painted. So I used that basic geometry node setup to add the rocks and the pebbles to the ground. And then at this point the scene was getting kind of laggy because everything was pretty high poly, so I decimated the back hill objects as well to make them lower poly because they were pretty far back, so I didn't really need to see them in very much detail. And then I added a few different geometry node setups to the plane to add the rocks and the pebbles to the ground. Now the scene again was getting a bit laggy because there were so many rocks and so many pebbles. So what I did is I actually deleted all of the ground mesh that the camera couldn't see, and this made the scene much more low poly, and then also because the ground plane was smaller, I didn't have to add as many of the rocks in the geometry nodes. And so this optimized the scene and made it much lower poly and less laggy. Now I wanted to make sure the environment looked really good, so I actually hid the rover from the render, and then I just just rendered out the environment, and then I looked really closely at the rocks to make sure it all looked really nice. And then I went back to the geometry node setup and I kind of tweaked the amount of rocks and kind of tweaked the placement of them to make sure they looked really good. Now I didn't want the rocks to be evenly distributed all over the ground, and so I added a noise texture into the geometry nodes, and then I also added a color ramp to make it very contrasty. And then I plugged that color ramp into the density factor. And this way some parts have a lot more rocks whereas other parts have less rocks. And so this makes it look more organic and natural. And then I added that same geometry node setup to the back hill objects as well. Now real quick, I did just want to show you how I created the rocks. So if you go to Blender's user preferences, you can turn on the Add Mesh Extra Objects add-on, and then once that add-on is turned on, you can press Shift A, and under Mesh, you can see that there is a rock generator. And so when you add this rock generator, Blender's going to generate rocks for you. So it's a very cool built-in Blender add-on. So in that Martian environment tutorial series, I used that rock generator to create the rocks. And then I also added some textures to those rocks from some different texture websites like CG Bookcase, Polyhaven, and Ambient CG. Now I wanted to make the larger rocks look like they had dust and dirt on the bottom of them, because Mars is very dusty. So in that Martian environment tutorial, what I did is I added a gradient texture, and then I also added a color ramp to make the gradient texture sharper, and then I mixed that gradient in the shader nodes with a mix RGB. And I made sure the gradient was starting at the bottom of the rocks, and then it kind of faded away as it went up to the top of the rocks. And then in the other color of the mix RGB, I gave it a sand color to look like the rocks were very sandy. And so this gave a really cool sandy and dusty effect on the rocks. So that's the basics of how I created the Martian rocks. So then I gave the environment another render again and just took a close look at that to make sure I liked the amount of rocks and pebbles. So once the environment was finished, I added back in the Mars Rover, and then I did a final render. And then after the final render, I finished up the compositing and got the finished image, which you can see right here. And again, if you'd like to check out the finished artwork, I will have the link in the description to the finished artwork on ArtStation. And I've also uploaded the Mars Rover to Sketchfab, so if you'd like to check out the Mars Rover 3D model in detail, then you can check out the Mars Rover model on my Sketchfab profile. Again, link is in the description. Now to upload this Mars Rover model on Sketchfab, I couldn't use the procedural materials in Blender, because all of the materials for the rover were procedural, but procedural materials don't work in other 3D software and they don't work in Sketchfab. So to upload the model to Sketchfab, I needed to bake the textures. So I baked all the textures of the Mars Rover, and I'm not going to go over the baking process in this video, but I've actually created a separate video on the texture baking workflow that I used to bake the Mars Rover textures. And I posted that video recently on my YouTube channel, so you may have seen it already, but if you haven't, I will have the link in the description. So this is going to wrap up the creation process video. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching. And I hope this video will help people out there who want to go out and create their own Blender artworks. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel to help me keep on creating Blender tutorials and Blender content, then I'll have the links in the description to my Gumroad store and my Patreon page and the YouTube memberships. And I do really appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to give me a little tip here on YouTube, you can also use the Super Thanks feature here on YouTube. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.